What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Atomfall. Just ahead of its official release tomorrow, Atomfall is an interesting game trying to do a lot of things. I believe the developers themselves described it as a bit experimental, which shows via its very free-form approach to its main quest as well as just exploration in general. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and while normally this is where I would tell you about my Steam profile being public, I actually received a review key for this, which was handled via the Xbox app on PC. So PC channel, we're still on PC here, but as a result of that, I'm just going to throw up the completion from the Xbox app here on screen, so you can see that instead. Normally I go through Steam and my profile is public though. But, as mentioned, I did receive a review key for this a few days back. I think it was like the 22nd or so, which is where I want to start talking about the game with one of the most important things I think to know straight away. This game is pretty short. As you could probably see just from that screenshot, it took me like 15 hours to 100% this thing. I've seen other people review this that have taken longer, but just know that it's not a terribly long game, and as a result of this, it's probably worth a mention that, basically covering much of anything could definitely be considered a spoiler here, and to that end, to give people a sort of TLDR on this game, I liked it a lot. I'm absolutely recommending it. I do think the $50 US over on Steam is maybe a little bit high, especially for just how much game there is here, but I enjoyed it enough for what it is that I'm okay with that. I think in a perfect world it would have been like $35-40, but it is what it is. So if this looks like something you want to play, I would highly encourage you to go into your first run blind, because I think that is where this game shines the most. But if you still happen to need some convincing, we'll get on with the rest of the review now. So straight away, another thing that I've seen just all over the place, everybody and their mom seems to want to compare this game to Fallout, and I don't think that is true, nor do I think it is fair to this game, in the sense that I think this game does a lot of different stuff that is worth evaluating on its own. Because if you go into this game just expecting it to be Fallout, I honestly think you're going to be disappointed. Especially since the game itself is very freeform, making use of some core systems to guide you to what the game's sort of end goal is. If anything, I would describe this more as a tabletop one-shot, where you have essentially a goal in mind, and how you get there is largely up to you. And to that end, this game has 6 different endings, or that is to say 6 different ways you could get to the ending with some variations therein. And the game really isn't going to give you quests per se. Rather, it's a sort of notebook or journal, just gives you a bunch of information in terms of general things that you have found out about the world you are experiencing, and then actual leads you can track down, which are more like quests, but a little more open-ended in the sense that you can kill absolutely anybody that gets in your way and solve those within the game's systems any which way you please, really, and the game will carry on. And while the game itself, due to its size, is inherently a little bit limited, I really do think that stuff, especially going into it blind for the first time, is the best part of this experience, and why I enjoyed it so much. Let's start diving into the rest of this. So, how is this game running with the technical state? So, I personally didn't really encounter much in the way of issues. Mainly, this game just didn't like my recording software, so that happens sometimes when you're recording footage for various videos. Some games don't like to be recorded, and this will lead to crashes and things like that, which was the case with Atomfall. I doubt the average person would experience that, but I did have some issues when I was recording, but otherwise it ran pretty smoothly. And the only thing that actually happened over the course of my, 15 hours with it, I suppose, is that one time the audio completely cut out and I had to restart it. Given that the game is in its early access period from the deluxe edition, I can take a look over on Steam and see the early reviews for it, and nobody really seems to be encountering much of an issue there either, so I would say it's probably fine in that regard. Moving right along to difficulty, so Atomfall is a game with a variety of difficulties, both presets and modular stuff that you can adjust on the fly. The main stuff this affects is the various aspects of combat, survival, and exploration. I will say that in terms of literal difficulty, the biggest thing that seemed to change here for me was just the amount of enemies you are running into. On the game's recommended difficulty of Survivor, which is effectively normal, you're going to run into quite a few enemies at times, and when you start lowering it, you just encounter less enemies overall, thus making the game easier. But just outside of that, though, there are a whole host of individual things things you can actually engage with, like how much loot you're running into, how efficient your healing is in terms of actual combat. But even outside of combat, there's other stuff. You can actually have markers for the various things you're looking for. You can choose whether or not to show a compass, or even whether or not to mark what leads in your journal are in fact part of the main story of the game versus just optional side stuff. But as a huge fan of modular difficulties, glad to see some options here, and you really can sort of customize that any which way you please. And then immediately after that, we're going to get thrown into the game world itself. So there is no character creation or anything. We play a sort of nameless individual who just so happens to wake up inside of what they call the zone. Specifically, the Quarantine Zone, which is an area that has been quarantined, if you'd believe it, around the Windscale plant. So this game takes place in a sort of alternative history surrounding a real-world incident known as the Windscale incident, which happened at a nuclear plant. We are immediately confronted by a scientist who, wants to know what you're doing here, obviously, but interacting with him will help us get on our feet and also gives us access to a modified key card. After escaping this initial bunker, you're likely going to run into this phone booth, take a phone call that will then instruct you to the game's main goal. Access a place called the Interchange so you can further access something called Oberon. Now that is as much as I want to say in terms of specifics for the sake of spoilers here, with the rest of the story basically being about both finding this place but also then gaining access to what you need to get to. And this sees you running around interacting with a bunch of different factions and people who can potentially help you do all of this. And then how you choose to interact with those people via violence or cooperation or a handful of other ways you might treat any individual character then leads to your way through the game. Now, for the most part, especially for the runtime, I think this is pretty cool. For instance, you can run straight up to these people, dome them in the head, and then as long as you've got the ability to run away, you're pretty much good to go. And then, even if you kill the sort of major plot characters for the main story, the game gives you a sort of always available backup plan, just in case you happen to mess up absolutely everything. And the story, as a result of that, is very freeform. And then, obviously, on the side of that, there's the actual, what is going on here? Why has this place been locked down? What happened at that plant? And how have the people here been getting along since? And you can discover all of that as you play the game, and I thought it was really well done and put together. So if this was, in fact, an experiment for Rebellion, the developers, I would personally call it a success. I thought this was awesome, and the first playthrough is likely to be your best one. That said, we are going to be progressing as we move through this place, so let's talk a little bit about progression. So as we play a nameless, faceless character, there aren't a whole host of like RPG systems at play here, but there is some stuff. So first up, we have manuals and training stimulants. We have a whole host of skills we can learn, but we need to do two things to do so. Outside of the starter set of skills, in order to learn anything, you first have to know about it, which involves learning from manuals you can pick up, which will then teach you new skills that you could potentially learn. In order to learn the skills you have unlocked, you then have to find training stimulants out and about throughout the world, scattered here and there, typically in relation to like the science-y outposts and stuff like that. And once you have enough of those, you can actually learn those skills, and thus is how you improve. You can beat the game with a minimal amount of these, but they are pretty helpful generally, especially when you gain the ability to do things like, say, disarm traps as an example. And then you can also lean into some of the game's sort of basic archetypes in terms of going for a more stealth-based approach or guns blazing even. So you certainly have some options there. Now there is a little bit more progression via crafting and the gear itself that you'll be finding. Crafting is obviously just learning recipes and then using all the junk you're picking up to then craft that into useful things like, say, bandages, various tonics that can increase damage, reduce incoming damage, give you resistance to either radiation or the infectious material that seems to be hanging around here and there, or even just some straight up explosives, which is always a good time. And then lastly, gear. And by gear, I mostly mean a few key items as well as guns, basically. So you start out with just about nothing, but there are a few key items like a flashlight, a metal detector, and then later on a signal redirector, which will help you open doors and stuff. And thus progression around what you're able to access via this is definitely a thing. And then as you explore the game, you'll initially find like rusty versions of weapons, which are still pretty good, but then later on you can find improved versions of those weapons like stock or pristine, though I do think you have to actually craft the pristine. I never found any of those actually just laying around. but there is a skill that will let you upgrade your weapons via crafting, and you can get improved versions that way, which I thought was pretty helpful. But that is the bulk of progression in this game, which brings us to the gameplay, the world, and the combat, which is all kind of one thing, so I think we're going to go through and do all of that at once. Basically, the game is divided up into 4 zones. Each zone is more or less home to a faction that is, to some degree, people you can interact with. The initial zone you find yourself in, Slatendale, hosts the outlaws or the bandits. You can't really engage with these guys much outside of just straight up combat, but they do have a base here, and you can, of course, engage them or avoid them while also plundering everything they have no doubt plundered from everybody else. Now, in Wyndham Village, we meet Protocol, the sort of military occupational force here that is designed to actually be enforcing the quarantine. They have their own goals, not least of which is making sure that people don't fall prey to the Druids. The Druids control Casterfell Woods. They have been hearing voices in the soil, as they call it, which you can investigate and learn more about, of course. And then lastly, we have Skethermoor. The Protocol largely controls Skethermoor as well. It is home to much of their bases and actual military camps outside the village itself. Now, beyond just those sort of factional groups, there are a whole host of other sort of independent actors, let's say, that you can meet and run into with their own goals and information and relation to the incident that took place here. And the general gist of the gameplay, then, is that you first find all these people, run into various encounters and setups, like, say, a woman murdered in a church, or a woman hiding something in a bakery, because whatever happened here, there does seem to be some sort of infectious material that drives people crazy, and ultimately transforms them into what are known as ferals. But finding both the factions, those independent actors with their own things, and then deciding who to trust, who to believe, who to be cautious around is really everything that goes into the gameplay here. Now, standing in the way of you doing all of that, though, is the enemy and then the environment itself. Now, enemies are interesting because you can actually side with factions in certain places, meaning that areas that were once considered trespassing for you to be in will suddenly be okay, and they won't necessarily aggro immediately. For instance, you can't initially go into the protocol camps, but if you do a little work for their captain, suddenly you're free to roam around so long as you don't start any violence. On the flip side of that, though, there are areas that are simply dangerous to be in because of things like radiation or some environmental effect. For instance, there are plants that will blow up if you get too close to them. There are swarms of enemies via things like swarms of rats or leeches that sometimes infest waterways or other areas that you'll have to deal with. Sometimes you can put a permanent end to these things by either just killing them all or killing the thing they're spawning out of, which can happen sometimes, especially with the rats. And then later on, you can even get some crafting items to attract and blow up swarms to help you get rid of them. And then there's other stuff like that signal redirector I mentioned earlier. So navigating both the environment and learning what does what and what to avoid is a big part of the gameplay and combat as a whole, because you have to, of course, balance those against literally shooting at things. Now, my one sort of gripe for this system is that it's a little too easy to play every single side with the factions. There definitely is a way to progress through this game and do essentially everything at the same time, because a lot of times the faction stuff is sort of easy to exploit. As an example, when you get access to the protocol camps by helping out their captain, you can then use that access to further the goals of everybody else you're working with, and at no point do they ever seem to realize that you're not helping them or react to that in any way. And in fact, that actually extends to things like just stealing everything that isn't nailed down. So long as you are not trespassing in an area, you are free to take everything there. That is to say, everything that can actually be picked up. And if any game would have benefited from a sort of theft mechanic, this would have been the game for it. And I realize it might just be a little too small and reined in for something like that to have been cost effective in terms of game development. But I do think a system like that would have really benefited the actual gameplay of this one, because as it stands, it's too easy to just walk into a place, quickly help someone get access to everything, and then just steal all of it, and nobody cares. But talking a little bit about the enemies we are going to be facing, I've already mentioned a few of them. A lot of them are sort of standard humans for the most part. That is to say, they are humans and they're either got military gear via protocol, or the druids are mostly a melee group, and then things like the ferals are just highly resistant to damage but don't have much range capability in any way at all. And then later on, you even meet some enemies that are borderline unkillable and best to just avoid entirely. But then there's also other stuff like the robots, which I think are particularly eye-catching. The robots are exceptionally deadly, but they can be dealt with by dealing enough damage to them quickly enough that they will sort of have to vent their heat, which exposes their battery, which then you can either just take from them, which shuts them down, or attack it, which will just blow the robot up permanently. And while you can definitely go in guns blazing, there are a whole host of other options. There's a host of melee weapons for starters. You can also throw melee weapons even, and then stealth is always viable as well, though you'll probably need to put some skills into it to be good at it because things can notice you pretty quickly. Now what helps here, though, is that enemies, especially outside of their main areas where you would be considered trespassing, are usually not necessarily keen to get into a fight with you, which I believe is supposed to reflect the fact that everyone's trying to salvage ammunition because it's a quarantine zone and they don't have access to making much more. But because of this, if you avoid enemy groups or don't get too close, you can usually just sort of walk away without actually engaging with them. But then, once combat actually starts, melee enemies, if you point your gun at them, they will typically back off from you and maybe try to throw a consumable or something instead, but they've got a little bit of leeway. What's more, though, enemies are actually more aggressive when they're on their own territory, which I thought was a neat touch. So enemies that might back off normally will just charge you in big groups when you're in their territory, which was a sort of interesting dynamic element to just the whole experience. So when it comes to gameplay, exploration, combat, it really is about sort of dealing with what is right in front of you, both in terms of how do I get the resources to proceed, be that literal resources in terms of scarce ammo, buffs, things I need to power up, so to speak, to then prepare for the scenario ahead of me. Will it be more convenient to just sneak by this group of enemies, or do I have the resources to just take them out? And that sort of freedom of approach combined with the freedom of, just exploring and engaging with the main story in pretty much any which way you see fit via this lead system is really what makes this game work so much, and I enjoyed a ton of it. Which brings me to the Steam Deck section. So I was able to play this on the Steam Deck, and happy to report it runs very well there. It is in fact verified as well, and luckily I would say with the relatively reined-in scope of this game, the Steam Deck I do think is actually a pretty good place to play a title like this. And while you may need to adjust a couple of the graphical settings in order to get like a slightly more consistent frame rate, as it will dip a little bit out in the open areas, it otherwise didn't seem to have any problems playing this, and again, it really just seems like a good place to play a shorter title like this. So definitely doable, seems to be in good shape on that platform. Which brings us to our positives and negatives. So on the positive side of things for this one, I really enjoyed the sort of free-form progression, both in terms of character progression as well as how you progress the main story. I really liked how that stuff blended together, and if anything, I just want to see more of that in a sort of more ambitious form. I think would be really cool. As a result of that, things like exploration feel really impactful. Not least of which because of the difficulty setting you're playing on, but there are a whole host of optional things to engage with as well, and then you can learn all about what happened here while, of course, also engaging with individual systems in order to progress through that individual place, and then you're usually going to come out of that with, say, extra skills or items that will be useful for you as you try to figure out everything else going on here. And then, honestly, I thought the story itself was really cool. It's probably not going to blow you away or anything. I think if you honestly just sit down and think about this whole situation for a minute, you'll probably see more or less where this is going. But I still think it was handled really well, and I loved learning about it as the story progressed. On the negative side of things, it's pretty much obvious stuff. The game is very limited in scope, both in terms of runtime, but also just actual systems and the like. And as a result of that, it's a little too easy to, as I mentioned, play basically every faction against each other at the same time, especially when you have systems like that trespassing, where I mentioned that as long as you aren't trespassing, you can very easily just hoover up absolutely everything and nobody says or cares about it. And in a game like this, where they're reacting to so much else that you do, it really seems like a limiting factor. Which brings me to my conclusion. For the most part, I thought Atomfall was a really good time. A bit of a short and sweet, perhaps very replayable game for someone to mess around with, but I will say it shines on a first playthrough. Once you kind of already know where everything is and how to abuse certain things and who will and won't react to certain things, it becomes extremely easy on replays. So I do think your best experience will be that first run, just because of the way all of this is laid out. But overall, again, I had a really good time with it, and if anything, I would just want to see them do more of this and maybe go for bigger and bolder next time around. But otherwise, it's great. Now, I will say again, at $50 US over on Steam, I do think that is a little expensive for what you're getting. I think it's a good enough time to justify it, but even then, it's also on Game Pass as well if you want something a little cheaper. So that's certainly an option for people. But that's going to pretty much wrap up this video, so I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know down below how you felt about this one. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.